Remember, remember, the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. But if there was ever a plot we all forgot, it occurred over in Whitehall. For a group was formed to kill a king in all but name, and yet they failed all the same. Hello and welcome back to the Jammy History podcast, the podcast that aims to spread the truth about the history you didn't know. And welcome back to Season 2. It has been a very long time. Thank you to all of those that have waited for these brand new episodes. I am your host Jamie, and today we will be delving into the Whitehall Gunpowder plot. How a team of assassins attempted to blow up Oliver Cromwell. Buckle up for a tale of treachery, plots, and just sheer incompetence all the way through. If you like this episode, then be sure to follow the podcast and any of my socials where I will be posting relevant material to this episode. Links for all of them will be provided in the description of this episode. The Whitehall Gunpowder plot comes after a period of destruction and chaos that is known as the British Civil Wars, also known as the English Civil Wars or the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, whichever you prefer. This was a series of civil wars that raged across the country from 1642 to 1653, as the country was divided between those that supported the monarchy and those that supported Parliament. For years, the country fought a bloody, uncivil civil war, which led to a conclusion that many thought unthinkable: the public execution of a monarch. King Charles I was put on trial for treason and found guilty, taken to Whitehall and executed. In the following years, Parliament took control over the country and tried to figure out how the whole ruling thing actually worked. But to some, it appeared that Parliament could never be the effective institution it had hoped to be without a strong figurehead to lead them forward, like a king. But they couldn't just put the king back in charge, that would be ridiculous. But they could do the next best thing, and have a dictator in all but name. And so, when Oliver Cromwell dissolved Parliament in 1653 with the support from the army, and appointed himself Lord Protector, there were many that embraced this resolution. Oliver Cromwell was a man who could get things done. He had gained power and fame throughout the civil wars by exhibiting a degree of military competence, something that was lacking from both sides during the civil wars. His skill leading cavalry on the battlefield helped turn the tide of some battles, and his organisational skills were crucial to the creation of the new model army. Cromwell was pious when it came to faith, and decisive when it came to politics. You can understand why his takeover was accepted by many. Surely he could bring together the change this country needed now that they had toppled the old order by executing the monarchy. But not everyone was satisfied by this resolution. One group in particular were what you would call a little miffed about the whole thing. This group were known as the Levellers, and they were fuming about Cromwell taking over. The people of the country were meant to be saved, but now it just felt like they were under new management. Their attitude towards the Protectorate does make complete sense when you realise that it goes against everything they stood for during the Civil Wars. So, who were the Levellers, and what did they believe in? The Levellers were a political movement that began during the Civil Wars within the parliamentarian army. It attempted to address the big questions surrounding the civil wars. What would become of the monarchy? What would change after the war ended? Why should people care about who won the conflict? These were big questions, and boy did they give answers to them. Even at the beginning of the civil wars, there were early levellers throwing around big ideas that shocked the moderates within Parliament. They were the first group to suggest the abolition of the monarchy. This was an idea that shocked the moderates and even Cromwell's faction within Parliament, but it was an idea that soon Cromwell's gang would accept. Now, I don't believe the Levellers were advocating that the king should be executed right at the beginning, but they at the very least wanted the monarchy gone somehow. This wasn't their only seemingly radical idea, Practically everything they stood for was in some way shocking to many of the parliamentarians. They argued for universal suffrage for all men, which is an idea that wouldn't become a reality until 1918, the toleration of all sects of Christianity, electoral reform, biennial elections, religious freedom, an end to imprisonment for debt, end of corruption within Parliament and the judicial system, and the translation of the law into common tongue. It's an impressive list of demands. Many of these ideas are things that we would actually relate to in modern democracies. It's not a perfect system, like there being no voting rights for women, but it's a start, I suppose. It's actually really fascinating to watch the Levellers arguing for such seemingly modern ideas about democracy all the way back in the 17th century. Could you imagine if they actually got to implement their ideas after the Civil Wars? But alas, the takeover of Cromwell put an end to the Leveller dream of a redefined democracy, and they became a marginalised political group during the Protectorate. Now, I have referred to the Levellers as the radicals of the parliamentarian cause, and their ideas clearly shocked the rest of Parliament. So you may be correct in wondering why it took so long for them to become sidelined in politics. Why weren't they just ostracised as soon as they began spreading such ideas? Well, it's because the Leveller course took hold within the parliamentarian army itself. Several officers agreed with their ideals, and unless you wanted to do a Stalin-like purge during a civil war, you really weren't going to do anything about it. The Leveller soldiers would promote their ideas and encourage others to fight for that promised future. They even established a system of political activism within the army itself. If you had a problem with your officers or being sent to die for some godforsaken campaign, then all you had to do was speak to your nearest agitator, the Leveller chosen to represent that regiment's concerns and bring them towards Parliament. High Command hated the Levellers because they would encourage the soldiers to discuss what made them unhappy or even mutiny to force their demands on Parliament. As I'm recording this, Britain is currently undergoing a wave of strikes that are attempting to force Parliament into making life better for them. And this is something that Levellers have been encouraging almost 400 years ago. But once the war ended, there wasn't a need to keep the pesky Levellers around anymore, and they were quickly sidelined. So imagine if you were a Leveller. You have just fought and suffered through a long period of strife, of violence, chaos and death, fighting for a cause that you believed in and hoped would lead to the creation of a more democratic country that would benefit all, only for that dream to be ripped apart at the last moment and for the country to fall into the hands of a quasi-king. You would be furious. Many former Levellers were furious, and some decided that they had to act. This is where we introduce our main character for this episode, a Leveller that dreamed of making his ideals a reality. This man was Miles Sindercombe. Sindercombe is a man that went through most of his life unnoticed. We don't even know where he was actually born. All we know of his life before the Civil Wars was that he was born in Kent, and that he was apprenticed to a surgeon. But when the Civil Wars did break out, he quickly joined the parliamentarian army. Either through choice or through coercion, it's not exactly known, and he began marching on the long military campaigns of the war. It was during this time in the army that he'd heard of these bold and radical new ideas about what the country could be like once the war ends. These ideas were of course from the Leveller movement we have just discussed, and boy did Sindercombe like them. But in 1649, he would be forced into an early retirement when he joined one of those mass mutinies in an attempt to get high command to meet with the Leveller terms. This mutiny, however, failed, and order was restored to the ranks. But one person that was not restored was Sindercombe, who decided to flee when everything went south and took his chances out in the wild instead. This wouldn't be the end of Miles though. it was only the beginning. It wouldn't be until 1655 that Miles returns onto the scene once more to give this whole revolution thing a go. This time, he emerges as part of a cavalry squadron based in Scotland. He attempts to appeal to the Scots' natural hatred for the English and pushes them to rise up against Cromwell and depose him, and preferably execute him in the process, just like they had done with the real king. And while they're at it, they could also be kind and enforce a few of those fancy leveller policies he'd heard such good things about, and has absolutely no affiliation with the group. In a way, he's a paid lobbyist, except he's representing a political movement that no longer really existed. And no one was even paying him, so he was just the worst shill you could ever have. But even if he managed to get his squadron to join the cause, he would need a few more men if he was ever going to have a chance of defeating his nemesis. So he began conspiring to take over a local army based in Scotland and turn them against the Protectorate. Unfortunately for Sindercombe, his plot would be exposed prematurely, and he was chased out of the country. With nowhere in Britain left to go, he fled to the favourite tourist destination for political exiles, the Netherlands. It was here in the Netherlands that Sindercombe would meet a man of similar interests, a man known as Edward Saxby. Saxby was an interesting individual to be sure. He was a leveller, just like Sindercombe, but had a different experience of the civil wars and the Protectorate. Saxby actually continued working for the Protectorate after its creation, leading expeditions into Ireland and working on diplomatic espionage missions in France. Saxby appears to have adopted a policy of working with the Protectorate as a means of achieving his leveller ambitions. But the tipping point for Saxby came with his ambitions for France. While he was exploring France, attempting to understand the political situation within France, he came up with a rather bold vision for what England's next goal should be. He proposed a joint invasion of France to depose the monarchy and introduce a French republic with a series of ideas based around the Leveller Manifesto. That's right, he wanted to bring the French Revolution nearly 200 years early. If he succeeded, then the Protectorate would have a friendly republic to itself, granting a useful ally in Europe. But to pull this invasion off, England would have to make an alliance with another power willing to join the expedition against France. After all, I did say it was a joint expedition, so someone would have to join in. For Saxby, the natural partner for the English expedition had to be the Spanish. After all, they all hated the French, right? But to the Protectorate, there was nothing worse than allying with yet another monarchy, and a Catholic one at best. England was already looking at the possibility of contesting Spanish dominance of the Caribbean. Why on earth would they abandon such ambitions and ally with them now? Saxby's failure to gain support for his proposal propelled him from radical into rebel, and he too was forced to flee the country and hide out in the Netherlands. But his rebellion wouldn't end there. He still dreamed of achieving his Anglo-Spanish alliance, and there was only one way to get it: the assassination of Oliver Cromwell. It was during this time in exile that Saxby encountered Sindercombe, and the two began to conspire about how to bring an end to the Protectorate, how to bring an end to Cromwell. The Leveller plot against Cromwell had been born. The plot consisted of an elite team of assassins that definitely all knew what they were doing. Sadly, the size of the conspiracy remains unknown, but only a few get referred to by name. These leaders of the conspiracy were the Moneybags, Edward Saxby, the man that supplied the weapons and money to the other conspirators. The Brains, Miles Sindercombe, man of many plots, failure of all. While Saxby ran the group from the Netherlands, Sindercombe would be the man on the ground, leading the plot as it unfolded. The Trigger, John Cecil, former soldier dissatisfied with the Protectorate and prepared to bring his training and knowledge of explosives to a more noble cause. The con man, William Boyes, master of evading detection and putting guards into false senses of security. He would gather information on their target and use his charismatic skills to give off the perfect impression of innocence. The Super Trooper, John Troop, a member of Oliver Cromwell's lifeguards, his personal bodyguard. With this position, he could provide information about Cromwell's security detail and his schedules. With this ace team of assassins assembled, Sindercombe landed once more in England in 1656, having been blessed with glorious purpose. It didn't take long for his men to begin work on preparing for their big assassination. The plan was simple. Cromwell has a crucial weakness. After intense study, the plotters had uncovered the truth about Cromwell. He was weak to bullets. So the initial plan was to shoot Cromwell while he was in transit. Thanks to Troop, the conspirators always had advanced knowledge of his routes and could lay out the perfect ambush. But unfortunately, there was one small problem. They weren't actually good at this whole assassin business. I know, I said they were elite, but in reality, they were far from it. So let's just quickly run through every attempt they made to shoot Cromwell, but failed. The first plan was to assassinate Cromwell as he passed through King Street in Westminster. This was one of those roads that he went regularly down in his coach. Sindercombe rented a house along the street and set up a safe position to fire from. All he had to do was wait until Cromwell passed by one day and take the shot. But before this plot could take place, before Cromwell even set foot in his carriage, Sindercombe called off the whole thing. His reasoning? Well, when you're planning an assassination, you should always try to consider what would happen immediately afterwards. If you shoot at someone from a house, it wouldn't take long for the soldiers to come kicking down the door to apprehend you. So, it would be practical to have an escape route planned to prevent being captured. But Sindercombe only realised after he rented the house that he didn't have any possible escape routes. Realising that walking out the front door would not be a viable escape route, Sindercombe abandoned the plan completely and quickly resold the house. His next plan was to rent a house near Westminster Abbey and then do the exact same thing as he planned to do the first time. Shoot Cromwell with an arquebus. Now this time, Sindercombe made sure to hire a house with a back door so he could escape following the assassination. Look at that, he's learning. This time he went a step further as well and used an alias to prevent being tracked down if he managed to escape the initial pursuit. And so with that, Sindercombe, who was now going by the name John Fish, was ready to complete his mission. And so the day approached. It was the 17th of September, 1656. Cromwell was heading over to Westminster Abbey and would be completely exposed once he got out of his coach. The perfect time to strike. Sindercombe took his position, arquebus at the ready. He sees Cromwell get out of the coach and begin to walk over to the Abbey, exactly where Troop said he would be. Sindercombe lined up the shot and placed his finger on the trigger and... Oh, hold on, he needs to take that call real quick. I guess it's now fallen to Boyes to take the shot. But now there's a load of people on the scene. Gathering outside the Abbey to see Cromwell. How could they escape now with so many eyes on the scene? Boyes panics and runs out of the house, arquebus in hand, and flees the scene before it had even been created. And so just like that, another plot had to be discarded, and Cromwell survived yet another time. But it's okay, because Cromwell always went to Hampton Court on Fridays, so they changed location yet again and prepared to shoot him on his coach route, which he takes every single week. Troop had secured the details of the route and the timings. It was perfect. So Sindercombe set up his new firing position. turned his phone on to vibrate, and waited for Cromwell's coach to appear. And so he waited. And waited. And waited some more. And waited some more. And the day had ended without so much of a sign of Cromwell or anyone in his entourage. But how could this have happened? They had good intel. Well, Troop had secured the plans, but he failed to account for one unexpected factor: Cromwell himself. See, turned out that Cromwell wanted to take the scenic route to Hampton Court that day. You can't keep doing the same boring route every week after all, so he shook it up on the day in question and accidentally bypassed the street the Sindercombe had chosen to lie in wait. It could fully appear that Cromwell had become aware of the group's existence and masterfully avoided the trap that had been laid out for him. But really, the whole thing could be chalked up to luck. But it's okay, because Sindercombe would once again redraw the entire plan from the ground up for his last and unsuccessful shooting attempt. Hyde Park, Cromwell, guns ahead, shoot. That was as simple as it needed to be. Cromwell was going on a walk around the park, and so the gang would just shoot him and bolt for it before they could be apprehended. John Cecil would be the gunman this time around, and he brought his horse with him to the park. That way he could ride off once the deed was done. This was Cecil's time to shine. Cecil began to approach his target, with a pistol concealed underneath his cloak. But walking out in the open towards the Lord Protector does not go unnoticed, and he would be noticed by the target himself. Cromwell approached Cecil because he was interested in his horse. This was the perfect opportunity to take him out. But Cecil, disarmed by the unexpected interaction, suddenly got cold feet and backed out of the attempt. He just stood there, had a nice chat with Cromwell about the horse, and then went back home. As we have gathered, this group wasn't particularly good at the whole assassinating thing, and by this point they'd made so many unsuccessful attempts that the group's existence became known. Oliver Cromwell had a spy master named John Trullo. It was his job to detect threats to the realm and neutralise them. His spies on the continent had heard of this plot to assassinate Cromwell, and now he had some suspicious faces to put to that plot. Now he couldn't prove it just yet, but all he needed was a single screw-up to have the evidence needed to bring them to justice. And that screw-up would come with the next and final plot. On the 8th of January, 1657, they would commence their final plot, the Whitehall Gunpowder Plot. The Whitehall Gunpowder Plot was perhaps the most ambitious plot Sindercombe devised. As shooters, they'd all proven to be repeatedly unreliable, so it was time to change tactics. Sindercombe clearly had read up on that gunpowder plot that was attempted against King James I/VI, and he believed he could do the same plan, but on Cromwell. Clearly, Sindercombe had only read the title of the pamphlet and didn't consider how it actually ended up. But the premise of the plan was simple. He and his boys would plant a gunpowder charge inside the chapel at Whitehall Palace and detonate it when Cromwell went to pray inside. Because being the good Puritan he was, you didn't have to be a genius to know that Cromwell would be inside that chapel at some point. Once the bomb detonated, the chapel would catch on fire and the building would collapse from the explosion and fire, crushing Cromwell under a pile of flaming rubble. It was the perfect crime. If Cromwell survived the initial explosion, then he would have to survive the building collapsing on top of that. It just seemed unlikely that he was ever going to be walking out of it alive. And so, with the plan complete, the group got to work. Troop scoped out the security at Whitehall Palace and identified a safe route to allow the group to plant the charge without being detected. Boys brought out his chemistry set and created the bomb using gunpowder, tar and pitch. It was guaranteed to go up in flames when it detonated. Cecil was there. I honestly don't know what the point was with having Cecil in the conspiracy if he wasn't going to do anything, but bless him, he tried, I suppose. Once the bomb was created, Sindercombe brought it over to Whitehall Palace. Troops showed him the way inside and kept watch to ensure that there was no unexpected interruptions. Sindercombe creeped inside the chapel, careful not to draw unnecessary attention by accident, until he planted the bomb in a safe location. With the trap laid, he made a quick departure and laid in wait until the moment the trap could be sprung. All Cromwell had to do was step inside that chapel, like any good Puritan would do, and it would be over. The Protectorate was about to burst into flames. At least, that was what was meant to happen. Cromwell's uncanny luck struck once again. He would be saved not by a sudden change in faith, but he didn't just cast aside his love of the church, but someone in the group had a sudden change in heart. And that man is Troop. At the final moment, with the plotters just moments away from actually succeeding, Troop realised that he didn't want to be involved in a conspiracy anymore. The reality of what they were about to do had hit him like it was an epiphany. He waited until his other conspirators had fully left the premises before rushing over to alert the guards of what was happening. He warned Cromwell and Trullo about the bomb, the conspiracy, and admitted his own involvement in the group. Troop was taken to the side as the rest of the guards entered the chapel and disarmed the bomb, foiling the plot once and for all. In a way, there is poetic irony to this whole thing, especially when you factor in the Gunpowder plot we all know and love. A group of conspirators plot to cause a regime change in their favour, so they create an explosive device and plant it in an important structure to kill the head of state and use the chaos that would follow to impose their changes on society. But the plot is foiled by a conspirator that has changed their mind and warns the target of the plot before it could happen. Perhaps Sindercombe should have read the rest of that pamphlet on the original Gunpowder plot. That way, he probably should have seen where this was going. But Sindercombe would not have the time to learn from his mistakes, as the jig was now up. The plot had failed, and thanks to Troop's betrayal, the authorities now knew everything about the conspirators, who they were, and where they could be found. Before the group had time to realise the betrayal had occurred, the authorities had kicked down the door and began to rush in to apprehend the conspirators. As soon as the authorities appeared, boys took one look at them and basically dove out of the nearest window to escape being captured, fleeing off into the countryside, never to be seen again. Cecil did the polar opposite, and threw down his sword instantly and pleaded with the guards not to be killed, once again proving how much of a valued member of the team he is. I don't even know what my problem is with Cecil, but as this episode's gone on, I just keep saying mean things about him. But he definitely was the worst member of the group. Sindercombe drew his sword and began to fight off the guards, hoping to cut a path to safety. But eventually he was forced to concede, when part of his nose was cut off by one of the guards, and he was captured. Sindercombe and Cecil were sent off to the Tower of London to be interrogated and eventually imprisoned. Sindercombe was fiercely questioned by the men that worked for Trullo. They asked him about the plot. Who else was involved? Were there any more assassination plots planned? What did they hope to achieve? They asked him about it all, but Sindercombe defiantly refused to answer any questions, remaining as committed to the cause as he had always been. After all, he probably realised that his time was up anyway. He would not benefit from saying anything, so he may as well maintain some dignity in what time remained. And so Sindercombe was dragged before a jury and charged with high treason. It was not exactly the fairest of trials. After all, what defence could ever be presented to save Sindercombe from certain execution? Witnesses to their crimes were brought to the stand. Witnesses to his crimes were brought to the stand. It should come to no surprise that Troop was one of those that testified against Sindercombe. He had fully turned over a new leaf and provided compelling evidence as the inside man to the ongoings of the conspiracy. It is unclear whether Troop kept his job after his involvement was revealed. I would presume no former conspirator would remain a member of Cromwell's bodyguard, but you never know. Joining Troop on the witness stand was a certain John Cecil, who also testified against Sindercombe. That's right. While Sindercombe had endured the interrogation and refused to say anything, John Cecil just straight up told the interrogators everything they could want to know and more about the conspiracy. I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't also give away the PIN number for the group's credit card. It was thanks to Cecil that Trullo can now trace the conspiracy back to Sexby, who was still hiding out in the Netherlands. With all the compelling evidence brought before the court, Miles Sindercombe was found guilty of high treason on the 9th of February 1657 and was sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Once again, another similarity to Guy Fawkes. And what happened when he was captured? Similarities everywhere, I'm telling you. Sindercombe would never actually make it to his execution though, because he didn't want to live through that painful death. For those last days in his cell, he was visited by his sister, who brought an unhealthy amount of poison in with her and gave it to her brother. By taking the poison, Sindercombe was spared the pain of his execution and also the humiliation that would come with it. If he was going to die, it would be on his own bloody terms. And so, on the night of the 12th of February 1657, just one night before his scheduled execution, he drank the poison and died shortly afterwards. The following morning, his body was discovered by the guards when they came to collect him from his cell. Sindercombe would still be punished in some capacity, but he was at least not awake to experience it. His body was brought over to the execution zone and was buried underneath the gallows by the hangman himself. Probably furious he didn't get the chance to hang Sindercombe on those gallows he'd spent all morning putting up. And this marks the end of Miles Sindercombe. Even though Miles Sindercombe had died, he still remained an icon for revolution against Oliver Cromwell. Though Sexby had now been exposed for being involved in the assassination attempt, he still continued to conspire to have Cromwell eliminated to bring about his leveller government and the Anglo-Spanish crusade against France. The name Miles Sindercombe would live on in a pamphlet published shortly after his execution in 1657, titled Killing No Murder. This pamphlet, called Oliver Cromwell a Tyrant, explored what it meant to be a tyrant and asked the important question of when is it justified to kill one. The pamphlet concludes that the murder of Cromwell would have been completely justified and encouraged people to take up the sword and commit the deed. And at the centre of this call to arms was Miles Sindercombe. He had become the martyr for the cause, nobly poisoning himself before his execution and remaining steadfast in his commitments right up till the moment of his death. Although the true author of the pamphlet is not certain, it is a popular theory that Sexby authored the pamphlet himself. After all, Sindercombe was his boy. Of course he would prop him up onto a pedestal. But with Sindercombe gone, Sexby took matters into his own hands and got immediately arrested, dying just 1 year later in his cell at the Tower of London in 1658. And with that, the major players of the Leveller plot had failed, and Oliver Cromwell could continue ruling in relative security until his own death in September later that year in 1658. Miles Sindercombe and his fellow conspirators had failed to create the Leveller government they believed in, and to be fair, they even failed to take that much time off Cromwell's life. But even in their failure, you can see a tale of how far men would go to create their vision of a utopia, and who they viewed as obstacles to that vision. Cromwell's reign was full of conspiracies and plotters, both from royalists and disgruntled parliamentarians, but the details of these plots are often forgotten or neglected in favour of the famous Gunpowder plot we all know and love. After all, I suppose it would be a bit much to commemorate more than one failed assassination attempt, but when the 8th of January next comes about, perhaps give a moment to remember those plotters that failed in their own gunpowder attempt, and the world they attempted to bring about. And with that, we have reached the end of this episode. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, then be sure to follow and rate the podcast, and let me know what you thought about the episode. I want to hear your thoughts about these conspirators, and if they should be remembered just like we remember Guy Fawkes. Be sure to follow my social media pages on Instagram and Facebook. The links to these are in the description. I make regular history posts on those accounts, so you will always have plenty of new facts to learn. If you also want to support this podcast, then do go onto my Patreon and donate to me there, just like the wonderful Lara, Hannah, Historic Hills and my very own dad already have. Join the Jammy Gang, you know you want to. Join me next time as we cover a tale of battles at sea and a cruise line people would never forget.